And at the Ben and Gary Show, when we know dentistry, this is episode, I believe, number 4, and we have another question from our audience about how do you repair a cracked tooth or a broken tooth? And I think the way to be able to think about that, it's kind of a complicated subject, so let's simplify matters. What is a crack and what is really broken? A crack really refers to a portion of the tooth that actually has either a hairline crack in it or a frank visual crack in the tooth. And depends on how deep that actually is. It could be superficial or it could be quite deep into the tooth. A broken tooth is where typically a portion of the tooth has been cleaved off and that we need to now repair a portion of that tooth as the phone rings in the background. So maybe that's a patient calling about a cracked tooth or a broken tooth. It could be a question. Maybe we're that popular now that people are calling in and the hotline is the phone is jumping off the hook. But let's get back to the subject. Cracked versus broken. Really, it's a matter of starting with the dentist here. And how do we figure that out? We might have to just visually see if that tooth is actually fractured. We can sometimes visualize the crack. Sometimes it's very faint to be able to try and figure that out. Right. A lot of times it's patient symptoms that might help us with that. But how do we repair that? Well, we have to usually remove portions of the actual broken tooth and then make an assessment if, a filling or a crown that might actually be what's necessary.
We would probably start with a radiograph or an X-ray.
True.
To assess where the fracture ends up and relative to the bone level. So that would be a starting point also.
Yeah, and we have these new X-rays out that are referred to as cone beam 3D CTs that help us evaluate more difficult cracks that we can't see or be seen with a traditional two-dimensional X-ray. The crack can be very difficult to determine off of that, and we have to sometimes use our visual detection. We have to use an X-ray, and then now, like I said, with 3D X-ray, we can really see a tooth in so many different ways to help diagnose if this is truly a tooth that can be salvaged or that we may have to remove and think about a different solution. Broken teeth sometimes can be perhaps a little easier to fix because maybe only a portion of the tooth is actually fractured. And we can determine if a filling is going to be simply necessary, but most of the time, it's going to result in a crown. And when that happens, what do we have to do? We have to do sometimes a filling under the crown?
Right, depending on the extent of the fracture, how much of the tooth is broken off, and then also how much of the tooth is filled. So we usually will remove the old filling, and then that gives us the basis on which we can assess the remaining healthy tooth structure, and whether or not we can actually save it. But most times we can. And so, as Ben said, we will then do the build-up or replace the missing tooth structure, and then go ahead and prepare it for the crown. But again, it just depends on the extent of the fracture and relative to the bone level, and then most of the times it fractures above the gum level, so that makes it an easier fix. But if it goes beyond and gets down to the bone level, then that's where we have to decide whether or not we can actually save it, and whether it needs to be extracted, or whether we have to do an implant in that situation. So, but the main thing is that we have to assess the remaining tooth structure and how stable it is. So when the remaining tooth structure has fractures in it, then that becomes another situation where the cone beam or the CBCT can come into play and help us determine the extent of the fractures.
It's also useful to query the patient as to how did this fracture happen in the first place. Sometimes patients have some sort of understanding of how it occurred. One of the more typical ways in which a tooth can fracture is probably to the public is the obvious way is that from a trauma, an accident, a break. But what's more likely is that a tooth that is already heavily restored or has a large filling in it due to the location. A lot of times that might be in the back part of your mouth where we can chew the hardest. That is over time a tooth that has a large filling in it. Eventually, after so much chewing on it, you can end up with a fracture or a break, and that's probably the more typical way in which that occurs. Sometimes it's so obvious that there's just no way to be able to possibly save this tooth or save some grouping of teeth, and then they need to be removed. That's when our options kind of go from either a dental implant, which is state of the art, to perhaps a bridge which uses teeth adjacent to where the damage is and uses those adjacent teeth for support for a set of teeth that will be bridged across the gap. And typically that's kind of how we restore them.
That's what we do. We have to assess the situation, as Ben said earlier. So depending on how the tooth fractured and what the symptoms are, I mean, sometimes the nerve is involved, and we have to then recruit our colleagues that are root canal specialists to help us assess the nerve status. And so once they establish whether it's a healthy nerve or whether it's a nerve that needs a root canal, then that's another step that we have to consider. But most of the time, as we hope, that it doesn't require a root canal, and we can go ahead and do the procedure that same day.
So that's it about how we would potentially treat a broken or a cracked tooth. I hope you understand that there is a difference and that there are options that may not always require a crown. However, if you're looking for the most long-term, problem-free solution, many times that's exactly what we have to do. It's all about being able to save the tooth. Everybody understands the value of being able to hold on to their own teeth. We love being able to do dental implants and other more sort of state-of-the-art sort of types of treatments. However, there's no substitute for your own teeth. So we're going to go, and what really a dentist should do is go through the steps to be able to try and save your natural teeth. However, if it's not going to yield in a long-term result, often the solution is to either crown it or remove it and go with a dental implant. And that's really it for the Ben and Gary Show, this episode on how do we restore cracked and broken teeth. Look for us on the web, on the Ben and Gary Show, We Know Dentistry, as well as also Facebook at Smiles International DC. Those are just a few ways to be able to contact us. Please, please, please come to us with your questions. We want to be able to answer them. We really love this stuff. We can't wait to hear from you. Give us a shout.